My embroidery had been hanging in the living room for 31 years. That morning, it was gone. I walked from the bedroom to the hallway, then back, touched the wall, a pale rectangle where the paint had faded around the frame for 3 decades. The nail was still there, bare. My neighbor Pat Coleman had stopped by to borrow salt. I forgot to let her go. I just stood there staring at that nail. "Eleanor, where are your cats?" "I don't know. Maybe Adrian moved them, just temporarily?" He said they were visual garbage. Pat looked at the nail, then at me, then back at the nail. "Wait, this is your house?" It was. My name is Eleanor Whitney, 71 years old. I taught art in the same school for 30 years. For 31 years, my embroidery hung on that wall, ever since my husband Bill drove the nail and we argued about whether it should go 1 inch to the left or the right. Then my daughter Helen married a man who knows exactly what art is. His name is Adrian Blackmore. He runs a gallery. He explained to me that I know nothing. That morning, I stood in front of a bare nail thinking one thing. If my cats are visual garbage, what exactly is hanging in his gallery? 3 months later, I found out, and so did he, about himself. Pat took the salt and left without saying another word. I stood in the hallway for a while longer. Then I put the kettle on and sat down at the kitchen table to wait. Adrian always came home at 6:30. He never varied. That was one of the things about him. Everything ran on a schedule. Dinner at 7, gallery calls at 9, opinions delivered at precisely the moment they would cause the most disruption. At 6:28, I heard his key in the lock. He came in, set his coat on the hook Helen had installed specifically at his height, and walked into the kitchen. He looked at me. I looked at him. He poured himself a glass of water. "Did you find the embroideries?" "In the storage closet." "I thought we'd talked about this, the aesthetic coherence of the space." "We hadn't talked about anything, Adrian." He set his glass down, turned to face me with that particular expression. Patient, slightly sorrowful, the expression of a man who spends his professional life explaining difficult things to people who aren't quite ready to understand them. "Eleanor, I have people coming through this house, curators, artists, people whose entire professional lives are organized around visual literacy. When they walk into a room and see..." He paused, searching for the right word, and settled on needlework cats. "It creates a certain impression about everyone who lives here, including me." "I'm trying to protect Helen's professional reputation. By extension, yours." I looked at him for a long moment. He held my gaze the way he always did, steady, certain, already 3 sentences ahead in the conversation. "Where is Helen?" "Yoga. She'll be back at 8. I nodded, got up, rinsed my cup. "Dinner's in the oven." He looked faintly surprised. He'd been expecting an argument. I walked down the hall to my room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. It was only then, sitting very still, that I started to remember things. Not the embroidery. Earlier than that. I remembered the mug. 8 months ago, my blue mug with the chip on the handle, the one Bill had bought at a roadside market in Vermont the summer before he got sick. One morning, it wasn't in its place on the shelf. I found it in the back of a cabinet behind the good glasses. When I asked Helen, she said Adrian found chipped things depressing. I said nothing. Put the mug back where it belonged. The next morning, it was in the cabinet again. After the 3rd time, I stopped moving it. I remembered the chair. 6 months ago, Bill's armchair, the green one by the window where I used to sit to read in the evenings. Adrian had it moved to the spare bedroom. He said the color conflicted with the new rug. Helen said they'd move it back when they found the right spot. That was 6 months ago. The armchair was still in the spare bedroom, facing the wall. I remembered the introduction, 4 months ago. Helen's colleague's birthday dinner, the nice Italian place on Clement Street. Helen introduced me to her friend's husband, a man who worked in publishing. She said, "This is my mother, she embroiders." Not, "This is my mother, she taught drawing for 30 years." Not, "This is my mother, she has a collection of art books that fills an entire wall. She embroiders." The man had said, "How lovely," and turned back to his drink. I sat on the edge of the bed and added these things up quietly, the way you add a long column of numbers. You already sense the total before you reach the bottom. You just need to finish the calculation. Then I thought about one other thing, the interview. 3 years ago, before the wedding, I'd read a profile of Adrian in a small arts journal that Helen had left on the kitchen table. It wasn't a long piece, but there was one line I'd read twice and then cut out and put in the drawer of my nightstand, the way you keep something you're not sure what to do with yet. The interviewer had asked him, "How do you define art?" And Adrian Blackmore had answered, "Art is whatever the artist decides to call art. Full stop. The institution doesn't confer meaning. The academy doesn't confer meaning. The artist does." I got up, opened the nightstand drawer. The clipping was still there. I put it on the bedside table where I would see it in the morning. Then I went to sleep. The phone rang at 9 the next morning. "So?" said Pat. He said visual garbage. He used those exact words? Aesthetic crime, actually. He said, "Please don't come out of your room when the curators are here." A long silence on Pat's end. I could hear her breathing. Eleanor Margaret Whitney. Yes, that is a declaration of war. Pat, no, listen to me. I've known you for 22 years. You taught my granddaughter how to hold a paintbrush. You are a woman who once drove 4 hours in a snowstorm to bring soup to someone you barely liked. And this man who has been living in your house for 2 years, eating your food, told you to stay in your room. I didn't answer. What are you going to do? I'm thinking. Well, think fast, because I have opinions. I laughed for the first time in 2 days. After I hung up, I sat by the window with my coffee and let myself think properly, without interrupting myself. The facts were these. This was my house. Bill and I had bought it in 1991. My name was on the deed. Helen and Adrian had moved in 2 years ago after the pipe burst in their apartment, and they needed somewhere temporary. Temporary had become permanent with the quiet inevitability of temporary things. Adrian had repainted 2 rooms, installed new cabinet hardware in the kitchen, replaced the bathroom fixtures. Each change had been presented as an improvement, and each improvement had made the house look a little less like mine. Now my embroidery was in a storage closet. I thought about what I knew. I thought about the interview clipping. I thought about Adrian standing in my kitchen explaining visual literacy to me while I had been teaching children to see for 3 decades. I thought about Bill's armchair facing the wall in the spare room. Then I thought about the attic. Helen had mentioned it once, casually, a few months after the wedding. Something about Adrian's old college work being up there, a box of paintings from his student days. She'd laughed when she said it. "He doesn't like to talk about that period," she'd said. "He was still figuring things out." I set down my coffee cup. I was also still figuring things out. The attic stairs were at the end of the hall. I climbed them slowly, which had nothing to do with my age and everything to do with not wanting to rush a moment like this. The attic smelled of old wood and cardboard. Light came through one small window. There were 4 boxes against the far wall. 3 of them had Helen's handwriting. Books, Winter, Misk. The 4th said nothing. I opened it. Watercolors. maybe 30 of them, on loose paper, some mounted on thin cardboard. Student work, uncertain lines, oversaturated colors, the particular earnestness of someone who hasn't yet decided what kind of artist they want to be. And cats. Not all of them cats. There were landscapes, a few portraits, what appeared to be a still life involving a wine bottle, but at least 8 of the 30 were cats. A tabby on a windowsill, 2 kittens tangled together, a ginger cat looking out at rain. Warm, gentle, entirely without irony. I sat on the attic floor for a while looking at them. I wasn't gleeful. That surprised me. I'd expected to feel triumphant, and instead I felt something quieter. Adrian Blackmore, at 20 or 21, had painted cats because he loved them. Somewhere between then and now, he had decided that loving something simple was embarrassing. And he had spent the years since building a very elaborate structure around that embarrassment and calling it taste. That was a sad thing to understand about a person. It was also, I realized, extremely useful. I picked out 3 of the watercolors, the tabby, the 2 kittens, the ginger cat in the rain, wrapped them carefully in a piece of old muslin I found in the MISC box, and carried them downstairs. I put them under my bed. Then I went back to the kitchen and started making a list. The sock appeared on a Tuesday. I found it behind the radiator in the hallway, gray, balled up, one of Adrian's dress socks that had apparently gone missing for some time, given the state of it. I picked it up with 2 fingers, carried it to the kitchen, and spent the better part of an hour looking for the right frame. I found one in the spare room. A clean white mat, simple black wood, the kind Adrian favored for the prints he'd hung in the study. I mounted the sock on a square of white card, centered it carefully, wrote the label in my clearest printing on a strip of white paper. Collapse of Ambition, Mixed Media, E. Whitney, 2024. Framed it, hung it in the hallway at eye level, precisely where my cats had been. Then I went to make dinner. Adrian came home at 6:30. I heard him stop in the hallway. The silence lasted about 40 seconds. Then he appeared in the kitchen doorway. Eleanor, how was the gallery? What is that in the hallway? My new work. I've been exploring found objects. You mentioned I should engage more seriously with contemporary art, so I've been doing some research. Found objects are very... That is my sock. Yes. I thought the domestic intimacy added a layer of meaning. The everyday object elevated by framing and intention. I actually read that in one of your catalogs. He stared at me. I stirred the pasta. Take it down. Really? I thought the hallway placement created a nice dialogue with the architectural space. Owen Sharp used very similar logic in his last installation. You mentioned you admired his work. Eleanor. Although, if you feel strongly about the placement, I'm open to discussion. I was also considering the dining room. Pat appeared at the back door at that exact moment, which was either coincidence or intelligence gathering. She looked at Adrian, looked at me, looked at the pot on the stove. Something smells wonderful. Am I early? I had not invited Pat to dinner. Right on time. Adrian took his water glass to the study and did not come out until Helen arrived at 7:15. Over dinner, Pat asked Adrian a number of interested questions about contemporary art and the philosophy of the found object. She was particularly curious about how an artist determined when an object had sufficient meaning to be elevated to art status, and who got to make that decision, and whether the institutional framework of the gallery imposed limitations on genuinely radical work, or whether true radicalism, by definition, resisted institutionalization. Adrian answered for 20 minutes. He was good at answering. It was one of the things he did best. Helen watched her mother eat soup and said nothing. After dessert, when Adrian had gone to make calls, Pat leaned across the table. The sock was magnificent. That's not the word I'd use. What word would you use? An opening statement. Pat smiled into her wine glass. Helen, from the kitchen where she was loading the dishwasher, said nothing. But she'd heard. I was fairly sure she'd heard everything. 3 days later, I addressed the mirrors. Black electrical tape applied in neat strips across all 3 bathroom mirrors. Not jagged or angry, carefully done, measured, the lines parallel. I left the small mirror over the sink uncovered. Everything else got the tape. On a card taped to the largest mirror, disappearance of self in the age of consumption. Site-specific installation. E. Whitney, ongoing. Adrian discovered it at 7 in the morning. He came into the kitchen still in his undershirt with a small piece of tape stuck to his chin where he'd apparently attempted to shave by feel. I need to shave. The small mirror is uncovered. The small mirror is 4 inches across. I actually think working with a limited field of vision could be quite interesting. Constraint as creative. Eleanor, I have a breakfast meeting with a collector at 8:30. I looked at him. He was a handsome man in his 40s with excellent posture and currently a small piece of tape on his chin and a slightly wild expression around the eyes. You have 45 minutes. The small mirror is really quite adequate if you angle the light properly. He went back to the bathroom. I heard the water running for a long time. Pat arrived an hour later, ostensibly to return a casserole dish. She stood in front of the largest taped mirror for several minutes. You know, I haven't really looked at myself in a while. She tilted her head. And I'm completely fine with that. I poured her coffee. Did you know Herb used to say I couldn't carry a tune? Every time I tried to sing along to the radio. For 30 years, I believed him. I waited. Turns out I have a perfectly decent voice. I sing in the car now. Took me 3 years after he died to figure that out. She picked up her coffee. Just so you know, that's all. She didn't say anything else about it. Neither did I. But I thought about it for the rest of the day, about how long a person could be told they were wrong about something before they stopped checking. The tape stayed on the mirrors for 5 days. On the 5th day, Helen took it down herself, quietly, without saying anything to me. She didn't replace it with anything else. She just took it down and put it in the trash and stood in the bathroom for a minute, looking at her own reflection. I watched her from the doorway, but she didn't see me. The artists arrived on a Thursday. I had met Kylie Marsh and Mercedes Voss 3 weeks earlier at a community art space on Valencia Street. I had gone to an open studios event that Pat had seen advertised and insisted I attend. Kylie was 26 and made performance work involving duration and discomfort. Mercedes was 32 and described her practice as relational aesthetics, which, as far as I could tell, meant she sat in various places and paid very close attention to what happened. They were both genuinely kind people who happened to dress in ways that would give Adrian a small, contained heart attack. I had explained my situation. They had been immediately and enthusiastically interested. "You're staging a full domestic intervention?" said Kylie. "I'm engaging with the space artistically." "That's a domestic intervention." Mercedes had asked a number of practical questions about square footage and light sources. Then she'd asked about the emotional register of the project. Did I want it confrontational or absurdist or melancholic? Somewhere between absurdist and inevitable, I'd said. She'd nodded like I'd said something important. They arrived at 2 on a Thursday afternoon, while Adrian was at the gallery and Helen was at work. Each of them brought a bag. Kylie's bag turned out to contain, among other things, a yoga mat, 3 paperback books, and a thermos. Mercedes brought a small folding stool and a notebook. I showed them the space. They moved through it slowly, the way I'd seen good students move through a museum, not rushing toward anything, just looking. "Good north light in here," said Mercedes, standing by the living room window. Kylie had stopped in front of the bare nail on the wall. "Is this where your work was?" 31 years. She looked at it for a long moment. "Can I do something here?" "What?" She reached into her bag and took out a spool of red thread. She tied one end to the nail. Then she walked slowly backward across the room, unreeling the thread until she reached the opposite wall. She tied it off on a small hook that had previously held a coat. A single red line across the room, about knee height, simple as a sentence. "That's the negative space of a thing that was there. The thread marks where it should still be." I looked at it for a long time. "Leave it," I said. Mercedes had settled on her stool by the window. She opened her notebook. She didn't say anything else. She just sat. They were still there when Adrian came home. He walked in, saw Kylie reading on her yoga mat in the hallway, and stopped so abruptly he nearly dropped his bag. "Who is this?" "Kylie. She's an artist in residence." "In our hallway." Kylie looked up from her book. "Hi, you must be Adrian. Eleanor's told me about your gallery, the Blackmore, right? I saw your Hernandez show last spring, the ceramic work." Adrian looked at her. She had blue hair and paint on her jacket, and the serene expression of someone who has fully committed to being exactly where they are. "Eleanor, what is happening?" "I've been developing my practice, creating dialogue between domestic and institutional space. You actually mentioned that boundary was interesting territory. I think it was the piece you were discussing with that critic from—" "I did not mean in our living room. Although I do think the domestic setting is in some ways more honest than the gallery context, less mediated. Mercedes was just saying, 'Who is Mercedes?' She's doing a durational piece about observation. She's been there since 2. She says the light changes significantly around 4:30. Adrian looked through the kitchen doorway at Mercedes on her stool, who was looking out the window and writing something in her notebook. He stood very still for a moment. "I have 3 curators coming to dinner on Saturday." "I know. That's why I wanted to make sure the space had good energy by then." He went to his study and closed the door. From the hallway, I heard Kylie turn a page. "The dinner on Saturday I will not forget as long as I live. Not because of anything I planned, because of what happened that Adrian didn't plan. He had made reservations at a restaurant. The curators were coming here first for drinks, just the living room, 30 minutes, then out. He had put on a good shirt. He had arranged the furniture. He had asked, with great restraint, that Kylie and Mercedes not be present, and they had graciously agreed to come the following morning instead. What he had not done was check his razor. I want to be accurate about this. I had not hidden his razor. I had simply, 3 days earlier, incorporated it into a small sculptural object on the bathroom shelf, a piece I called Sharpness of Being, which involved the razor standing upright in a base of air-drying clay, wound about with red thread that matched the line Kylie had strung across the living room, and labeled accordingly. It was quite elegant, actually. He had seen it. He'd asked me to move it. I'd said I was still working on the piece, and could we discuss it after the weekend? He had apparently decided to handle this by using Helen's razor instead, which he had not mentioned to Helen. Helen discovered this at 6:15, 45 minutes before the curators arrived, and the conversation that followed was the first time in 2 years I had heard her raise her voice at him. Not at me, at him. I sat in my room and listened and did not allow myself to smile because that would have been ungracious. By the time the curators arrived, Helen had gone to her sister's for the evening. Adrian had a small nick on his jaw from Helen's razor, and the red thread was still stretched across the living room because in the rush of things, no one had taken it down. The lead curator, Owen Sharp, walked in, put his coat on the hook, looked at the thread, and said, "What's this?" Adrian opened his mouth. I came out of the kitchen with a tray of drinks before he could answer. Owen Sharp was not what I had expected. I had imagined someone like Adrian, the patient authority, the measured sentences, the permanent mild disappointment in the faces of those who didn't understand. Owen Sharp was in his 50s, compact with wire-rimmed glasses and the distracted energy of someone who is always slightly more interested in what's in front of him than in the conversation he's supposed to be having. He shook my hand and looked immediately back at the thread. "Did you make this?" "The original work was mine," I said. "A colleague added the thread to mark the absence." "What was the original work?" "Embroidery, cats mostly. 31 years on that wall." He nodded slowly, looked at the pale rectangle the frame had left on the wallpaper, looked back at the thread. Something moved behind his glasses. The trace. That's the piece. Adrian stepped forward. "Owen, let me show you what we've been—" "Just a moment." He was looking at me. "You're Eleanor." "I am." "Adrian mentioned his mother-in-law was staying with them. He didn't mention you were an artist." "He wouldn't." Adrian smiled the smile of a man standing on a trap door. The other two curators, a woman named Diane and a younger man named Raphael, had drifted into the living room and were looking at the thread from different angles. Raphael crouched down to see how it was tied to the nail. Diane was looking at the pale rectangle on the wall. "Is this an installation?" "It's a domestic situation." I set the tray on the coffee table, offered drinks. While Adrian was handing glasses around, I went back to the kitchen, opened the cabinet under the sink, retrieved the box with the 3 watercolors which I had moved there from under my bed that morning. When I came back to the living room, Owen was sitting in the chair by the window, Bill's chair, which I had moved back from the spare room 3 days ago without asking anyone, and Adrian was explaining something about liminal space and the domestic uncanny. I set the box on the coffee table. "I wanted to show you something." Adrian stopped mid-sentence. I took out the first watercolor, the tabby on the windowsill, set it against the books on the coffee table so it leaned at a slight angle, visible to everyone. Then the 2 kittens, then the ginger cat in the rain. The room went quiet. Owen Sharp leaned forward. He looked at the watercolors. He looked at the embroidery, which I had rehung that morning while Adrian was in the shower, back on its nail, back in its place, the red thread now woven through the bottom edge of the frame and stretching back across the room, connecting it to the wall. He looked at me. "These are not yours." "No, they're Adrian's, from college." A silence. Adrian was very still. He was 20, 21, still figuring out what he loved. He loved cats, simple things, warmth. That's what the work shows. I paused. Somewhere between then and now, he decided that loving simple things was a problem, and he built something quite complicated around that decision. I looked at Adrian directly. I've been thinking about that for 3 weeks. I think it's why he needs other people's work to be lesser. Because if a woman's embroidered cats can be moving, then maybe his gallery of conceptual objects isn't the only thing that counts. And if it isn't the only thing, then what exactly did he give up those kittens for? The room was completely silent. Owen Sharp picked up the ginger cat in the rain, held it at arm's length, set it back down. "She's right, you know." Adrian said nothing. His jaw was very tight. The nick from Helen's razor was still visible. "You were a decent painter at college. I've seen the student records. You stopped in your 3rd year." A pause. "You said in that interview, the Meridian piece, 2017, that art is whatever the artist decides to call art." I remember the interview. "So do I. So does your mother-in-law, apparently." He looked at me again. "Are you still making work?" "I am now." "The sock was yours?" "It's in the hallway." Diane made a sound that she converted, not quite successfully, into a cough. Raphael looked at the ceiling. Owen Sharp stood up. He walked to the hallway. He stood in front of the framed sock, "Collapse of Ambition, Mixed Media, E. Whitney," for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he took out his phone and photographed it. He came back to the living room and looked at the embroidery on the wall, the red thread, the pale rectangle next to it. "I have a group show opening in April. The theme is domestic record, objects and practices that persist against institutional pressure. I'd like to talk to you about contributing." Adrian made a sound. "And I'd like to talk to you about those watercolors. Not for the show, just talk. You have them in a box in the attic, which tells me you haven't gotten rid of them, which tells me something." Adrian looked at the 3 watercolors on the coffee table for a long moment. The ginger cat, the 2 kittens, the tabby on the windowsill. Something happened in his face that I hadn't seen before. Not the measured expression, not the patient disappointment. Something older and less certain. "My mother had a cat like that," he said. "The ginger one." Nobody said anything. "Her name was Tuesday." He picked up the watercolor, looked at it for a while. "I was 19 when I painted that." "I know," I said. He set it back down, picked up his wine, didn't say anything else. The dinner reservation in the end was missed. Owen Sharp stayed for 2 hours. We talked about the embroidery, about the thread, about what it meant to mark the negative space of something removed. We talked about duration and domestic practice and the intelligence embedded in craft. We talked, briefly and obliquely, about grief, about Bill, about the armchair, about what it means to maintain the traces of people who are gone. Adrian sat on the far end of the couch and refilled his glass twice and did not speak much. Helen came home at 9:30. She stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at her husband and then at me and then at the watercolors on the coffee table. She picked up the 2 kittens, looked at them a long time. "You never showed me these." "I forgot I had them." She set the watercolors back down carefully. "The embroidery's back up. This morning." She nodded, sat down in the remaining chair, not the green one, which I was using, but the smaller one by the bookshelf that had always been hers, the one with the yellow cushion that she'd had since college. "I'm Helen. I'm sorry I missed the beginning." "You didn't miss much." "I might have missed something." She looked at her hands. Then she looked at me. I looked back at her, at my daughter, who had been telling me for 2 years that this was helping, that this was better, that aesthetic coherence was important, and she hoped I understood. Who had been saying her husband's sentences in her husband's voice without appearing to notice. She had her father's eyes. She had always had her father's eyes. I didn't say anything. Sometimes there is nothing to say, and the kindest thing is to simply stay in the room. She stayed in the room. In the morning, Adrian made breakfast. Not elaborately. Eggs, toast, coffee. He did it without announcing it and without commenting on it. He set a plate in front of me and sat across the table, and we ate without talking. Helen came in at some point, poured coffee, sat down with us. The three of us ate in a silence that was not hostile, just quiet. After a while, Adrian said, "The sock is actually quite funny." I said nothing. Not the word I would use professionally, but Helen looked at him, then at me. But what? Nothing. I'm going to be late. He took his plate to the sink, rinsed it, and left. Helen and I sat with our coffee. Outside the window, a neighbor's cat had gotten onto the fence and was balancing there with elaborate unconcern. "Mom?" "Yes." "I don't think I realized—" She stopped, started again. "I think I've been speaking in his vocabulary so long, I forgot what mine was." I waited. "When did that happen?" "Gradually, the way most things happen." She looked out at the cat on the fence. "Tuesday," he said. His mother's cat was named Tuesday. "I know." "He never talks about his mother." "No." Helen wrapped her hands around her mug. "I'm going to suggest we talk to someone. He and I. A proper conversation. Not about art." "That sounds right." "Are you going to be in the show?" "I'm going to talk to Owen Sharp." "The sock is really quite funny, Mom." "I know." We finished our coffee. She washed up. She kissed the top of my head on her way out, which she hadn't done in 2 years, and went to work. I sat for a while. Then I went to look at the living room. The embroidery was on its wall. The red thread ran from the nail through the bottom edge of the frame and across the room. Kylie had added to it over the past few days. It branched now in 2 directions, one line ending at the window latch, one going up the door frame. It looked deliberate. It looked like something you might see in a serious gallery, which I thought was quietly funny, and also not funny at all. I thought about the cats at the center of it, the fat ginger one with the white patches, the tabby with the serious expression, the small gray one curled in a circle that I had stitched over the course of a single February when Bill was in the hospital, when I couldn't sleep and needed to keep my hands busy. They were not sophisticated. They were not ironic. They did not make a statement about the liminal space between domestic and institutional practice. They were just cats that I had loved while I was making them, and that love was visible in the work, the way it always is if you look. Bill had always known that. He'd driven the nail without being asked. Kylie left 3 days after the dinner. She came to say goodbye on a Tuesday morning, her bag over her shoulder, her paint-stained jacket. She shook my hand with the seriousness of someone who means it. "Thank you for the space. Thank you for the thread." She left a note on the kitchen table. I still have it. It says, "The red line is yours now. Do whatever you want with it." And below that, in smaller writing, "My dad called. We're going to lunch on Sunday. I think that's something." That was something. I thought so too. The group show opened on a Thursday in April. Owen Sharp had titled the section I was in, "Things That Persist." There were 6 artists. I had 4 pieces, the embroidery series, including the cats, and the one I'd made during Bill's illness, which Owen had asked for specifically, and which I had thought about for a long time before agreeing, the sock. And a new piece, just thread on a bare wall, red line, no frame. 31 years. I had not done anything elaborate. I had simply indicated the length of time with the length of the line. Adrian did not come to the opening. He had been invited. He said he had a prior commitment. I do not know if that was true. I found I didn't mind particularly. Pat came. She wore her good coat and earrings she'd bought for a retirement party 8 years ago and never worn since. She stood in front of the embroidery for a long time without saying anything. The gray one. The curled one. February. The last winter Bill was well. She nodded. She knew about that February. It's very good, Eleanor. I know. She laughed. I laughed. A woman nearby looked at us and then smiled, the way you do when you can see that people have known each other a long time. We went to get wine. 3 weeks after the show, Helen called me on a Sunday evening. She and Adrian had started seeing someone. A couples therapist, she said, twice a month. He had taken the watercolors out of the attic. He had put the 2 kittens on his desk at the gallery, where his assistant had asked about them, and he had said, apparently, that he'd made them when he was young and didn't know what he was doing yet. Is that what he said? Almost. He said, when he was young and still had the nerve to mean it. I sat with that for a moment. That's progress, Helen. I think so too. She called to ask if I wanted to come for dinner on Sunday. I said yes. She said she'd make the pasta, the one with the lemon, Bill's favorite. I said that sounded exactly right. After I hung up, I sat by the window. The evening was coming in, that particular late April light that does something complicated to everything it touches. The cats were on the wall. The red thread was still there. Helen had never taken it down. It ran from the nail across the room to the window, and in the low evening light it was barely visible, just a suggestion of something continuing. Pat would ask me later if I thought Adrian had really changed. I said, I think he remembered something he'd decided to forget. Whether that's the same as changing, I don't know yet. Ask me in a year. She said, fair enough. I said, he named his mother's cat Tuesday. She said, people are strange. I said, yes, that's the whole thing, really. People are strange and sad, and they paint cats when they're 19 and then spend 20 years being embarrassed about it. And then one day, somebody puts it on a coffee table in front of the right people, and something cracks open. And sometimes what's inside is worth the trouble. Sometimes it even turns out to be art.